friends. I'm your host, Dr. Dave Layton, and thank you for joining me in our journey to hope. It is my desire through this podcast to bring you information about how to discover, sustain, or perhaps regain hope. In this episode, we'll be speaking with Steve Duer. Steve is responsible for one of the most important programs I personally can think of. He's the executive director for Agape here in Central Alabama. Now, if you don't know what Agape is, Steve's going to be telling us about it, but basically it deals with foster care for children and also adoptive agencies. But there's some other things that they do, and so Steve's going to be talking about that. Now, this is a very important podcast to me personally because I was raised in an orphanage in my early life until I was about 11 years old. And then I became a foster child. Fortunately, my foster care was provided by a relative, but that's not always the case. And so Steve and Agape step in and provide a wonderful service through that ministry. Well, Steve, good morning.
Good morning.
Again, I'm sure there's a lot of folks that don't know what Agape is. And so I'd like you to take a little bit of time. First of all, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then let's talk about Agape.
Okay. Well, I'm the executive director, but my history with Agape goes back probably to the late 80s, early 90s when my parents fostered for Agape. And then I worked for the state for a period of time. And after grad school, I was supposed to go back to work for the state, and a hiring freeze intervened. And I needed a job, and just happened to have a meeting with my internship at the Agape offices and ran into Jimmy Dobbs. And he said, "What are you going to do when you graduate?" And I said, "It's a really good question." So that's how I got to Agape. And in 2019, Jimmy retired, and I became the executive director.
Okay, great. So tell us now what Agape does. I mentioned child placement services, but it goes deeper than that.
Yes. Our mission as an agency is that as a ministry of Jesus Christ, vulnerable children will find permanency in safe, nurturing settings. And we do that through a couple of services. One is we work with expectant moms in crisis. And that has really jumped since the Dobbs decision last year. To give you an idea of the jump that we saw, April to June, that quarter, 2022, we served 10 pregnant women. April to June this year, we served 29 pregnant women. And again, with our mission being permanency, a lot of those moms we know are going to make the plan to parent instead of to adopt. And if they can do that in a way, and we can help them set them up in a way where that child never enters the foster care system, then we have helped that child achieve permanency and achieved our mission. For the moms who do choose to make an adoption plan, we work with adoptive families. We call them ministry partners because we tell them on the front end, we're not looking for children for families. We're looking for families for children. So if a family comes to us and says, "Hey, I want a little girl, and we don't want to have any contact with the family and all that," well, we're not the right agency for you. There are agencies who do that. We're ministering to the child, but part of that ministry to the child is also an ongoing relationship and open adoption with the parent, because we know from research and even from the story of Moses the importance of identity in adoption.
Okay. I like your perspective on that because it is putting the emphasis on the child.
Yes.
And certainly we have preferences as parents, but I had 4 daughters, and I kind of jokingly told my daughters, "Hey," and by the way, I have 9 granddaughters. There's not a boy on the horizon.
So you might say you're in women's ministry then.
Yes, absolutely. But I kind of jokingly told my daughters, the first one of y'all that gives me a grandson, I'm changing my will. But and I still have granddaughters, but seriously, I love those little girls. I can't imagine not. And so again, the emphasis is on the child.
Right.
So thank you for that. I really, really appreciate that.
The last service that I'll talk about is our foster care service, which we work in partnership with the state. The state calls us and we use our foster homes to minister to those children. And for over 80% of the children we serve, we get no state funding. There's a small population of large sibling groups where we do get some state funding, but the rest of our foster care services are funded by churches and individuals so that we can be true to who we are as an organization, and also, again, see it as ministry as opposed to a business.
Yes. Okay. There are business elements to it.
Yes.
We're going to touch on that just a little bit later, but yeah, it's a ministry. Absolutely. That comes first. God's going to take care of providing that business element of it. Absolutely. All right. So you've kind of explained to us what Agape is and your role in it and how you got involved with it, so that's great. I noticed in your bio that you had experience as a child being in a family that took in a foster child. Well, I would understand from my perspective that when a family, mom and dad, they have some children and they're thinking of bringing in another child, that there's a lot of questions that's going to happen. And one of them obviously is going to be assimilating that child into an existing family. So would you talk to that just a minute?
Sure. We as a part of the becoming a foster parent process, we spend a lot of time getting to know the family, helping them assess their family for the type of child they can serve best. And one of those factors is what children are already in the home and what are their needs. We typically recommend that when families foster, they follow a birth order. So in other words, we don't want to see a much older kid supplant who's the oldest child in the home. We want it to go by birth order. There's exceptions to that.
Sure.
But most of the time we have found that, again, it's focused on the child. We want to set that child up to be successful in that placement and that placement to be successful. In order to do that, we know that disrupting birth order increases the chances of a disruption. So we're going to try to minimize those risks.
And you know, that's fascinating because we don't think about birth order, but there's some pretty interesting things about that. Okay, what about in situations where you are placing multiple children, siblings? I assume,
yes,
from my knowledge of it, limited as it is, that you do try to keep family units together.
Absolutely. The sibling relationship is the longest lasting relationship of your life.
Yes, it is. Okay.
And once that gets separated in foster care, reunification rarely happens. So we have a specialized program, like I said, for sibling groups of 4 or more to stay together. That takes special families.
Yes.
And that's the one that we get some state funding for, and that's to provide additional support to that family, because growing your family overnight by 4 to 6 kids needs some extra support. The groceries, the laundry, all that is just the time. All that is more when in those situations. But the thing that we do with siblings is we honor them. We honor them by keeping them together, and then try to encourage them to stay together throughout that whole process. Just recently, David, we had a sibling group of 5 children.
Wow.
That needed permanency. And the foster mom came to us, and she was a single parent foster home. And she said, I really want to adopt these kids, but I know I'm a little bit older, and I need to know what happens if something happens to me. So we sat down and we talked about it and said, really, you need to have a candid conversation with your children. Are they on board with if something happens to you? Just like any of us would have those candid conversations with our own children. You know, we got to have somebody who's going to be the guardian for our child in case something happens to us. Mm-hmm. Well, for her, that was a more significant need because you got 5 children. Some of them have some needs. They're going to need some care ongoing. But her children said, we're on board, Mom. We're going to do this. So end of July, this mom and these 5 kiddos and some of her biological kids walked into the courtroom for adoption. And one of the court officials looked at the youngest girl in the family and said, do you know why you're here? The little girl said, to be adopted. And she said, "That's great, but what does that mean?" And the older sister answered for the little girl and said, "It means we get to stay forever." And I can't think of a better answer for adoption. And those 5 girls, or it's a boy and 4 girls, those 5 children will be together forever now and not be separated. And that's because of Agape. And what I tell folks when I'm at churches or I'm meeting with our donors is they're a part of that story just as much as I am. Just as much as our staff are, just as much as that foster parent. Now in different degrees maybe, but we're all a part of that story.
Wow. Special families.
Yes.
Absolutely, and special children, because it can't help but be disruptive at some level. And maybe some second guessing on those days when things are just not as rosy as we think they're going to be.
You know, I was at a conference last week, and a guy was talking about that, and he was comparing it to the story of Elijah when he's in the wilderness and the ravens are bringing him the meals morning and evening. And we focus on the ravens when we tell the story. We don't focus on the fact that he was there for about a year.
Yeah.
Same thing every day, all by himself, all alone. And when we're in those isolated, all alone, things aren't happening the way they are, we don't tend to think about the ravens. But the ravens are still there. God's still providing for us. Yeah. And I think a lot of what Agape does for families going through tough times, through the moms that are often isolated, is we're being that raven, bringing the support to those people at that time. You know, I talk about our moms that we serve, and the theme of the podcast is hope. And that's really probably where we see the most hope giving.
Yeah.
Because when a mom calls us, she's in crisis. Something's going on financially. Since the Dobbs decision, we've seen an increase in moms who are dealing with domestic violence situations. And hope is just nowhere for them when they call. And we were working with a mom recently who was one of those moms who called, and she was in a domestic violence situation. And through some partners' resources and through some of our resources, we helped her get to a safe place. And once she was safe, she was able to make a plan to parent her little girl. So we did a follow-up visit with her recently. And she looked at our maternity worker and said, "Hey, can I have some of your cards?" And our worker said, "Of course, but what do you need my cards for?" And this mom said, "Because every pregnant woman I run into in my community, I tell them about Agape because Agape saves my life." Now, you're talking about hope.
Yeah.
We often think about the services to a maternity client as being important for that baby.
Yeah.
But here's a mom saying, it saved my life just as much as it saved my baby's life.
Right. And you know, it's interesting. Folks that I've talked to that are dealing, folks that I talk to that help people that are dealing with crisis and depression and those kinds of issues in their life, the consistent thing is reach out of yourself, looking to help, looking to do and be involved, and that always seems to help. Man, that is, again, special people that are involved with it. I have a little bit of a silly question. Describe for me a typical foster parent, and I know you're going to say no such thing.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting. As I think over our foster parents, we've got some folks who've been fostering for a long time, and we got others who are brand new. Some who waited till they'd raised their own children or got them their teen years. Others who fostered first before they ever had kids. And it's really been interesting to watch the different foster parents. But here's the thing that I see that's in common with all of them. At Agape, anyway, our foster parents are fostering out of a sense of mission. They feel they have a calling to do this. And our Christian culture sometimes talks about a calling as a clear thing that is easy to follow. But if you look at biblical callings, oftentimes they were very challenging to follow and had hardship as a part of them. And one of our families was interviewed by a church recently as a part of a special day for Agape. And the family was just real candid about, there's some days I look at my wife and go, why are we doing this? And then these things happen that, oh, this is why we're doing this. We're seeing the difference. And they're surprised by the blessings they've received as a family. But that sense of mission, that sense of, I'm here for a vulnerable child, and I'm strong enough to carry pain for both of us for a period of time. That's where our families are coming from.
Well, again, special people. Man, as I think about Agape, and actually every time I want to share with our audience, but also if gets your comments on it, I always think of two scriptures that absolutely come to mind. The first is James 1:27. James says, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. That speaks directly to Agape. And the idea of visit the orphans, that doesn't necessarily mean go visit them on a Saturday and maybe have a Christmas party and then leave. Visit means you're putting emphasis on that. You're visiting that situation.
The part of that verse that I often will emphasize is that in their distress or in their affliction.
Okay.
Because the work that we do is messy. If people have a romanticized view of working with expectant moms in crisis or working with foster families or even adoptive families in some situations, it is messy work because we are coming face to face with the brokenness of the world. And I think about James 1:27 to me, I always think the parallel of the Old Testament verse for that is Isaiah 1:17, where in the first chapter of Isaiah, I think starting in verse 10, Isaiah is basically laying it out for the children of Israel. Your worship literally stinks to God. He finds it abhorrent.
Yeah.
And in verse 16, he says, stop doing evil. In verse 17, he says, here's what you need to do.
Yeah.
Love justice. Defend the cause of the widow and the orphan. And seek justice for them. To me, that pure religion and, hey, if you want to get right with God, it's not just about stopping doing evil, but you got to do good too. And do good to the ones that God has a heart for, those vulnerable people.
I want to share a personal, I mentioned that I was raised in an orphanage, and I was there because my father was an alcoholic and was physically abusive. I found out years later, of course, as a child. I don't recognize all that. And most of the children that were there in that orphanage had one or both parents. And but there was some kind of a situation going on where it was just, that was the foster care system or the social structure of the time was an orphanage. Well, I remember during periods while I was there at the orphanage as a child, there would be parents or folks that were coming to look to adopt. And what they would do, we had a visiting room, and we'd get cleaned up and dressed up, not looking like our scruffy normal self kids, you know. And we would visit with that family, and basically we were on trial to see if that family wanted us or not. And I'll never forget that, because you couldn't help but walk away with a sense of rejection.
Yes.
I'm not good enough. And yet it's not that child. It's about the child, but really and truly. And eventually, by the way, I was taken in as a foster child by an uncle that I had a relationship with, my uncle and aunt. I say my uncle, it was my uncle and aunt. And they raised me as a foster child for a few years. But anyway, that was just a personal.
But mentioning that, and you talk about the idea of adoption, people think adoption is man's idea. Ephesians tells us adoption is God's idea.
That's right.
Before time began, he had a plan to adopt us as his children. And that adoption had nothing to do with our characteristics. It had to do with his desire to have a relationship with us and to restore a relationship that was broken. And I think that's the piece of adoption I've learned over the last few years. is adoption when it's done well. There's this Japanese art form called kintsugi, and it's how they repair broken pottery. Okay. And the origin story of it is a shogun emperor said a cup of one of his, or a bowl of one of his ceremonial tea sets got broken. He said, I want it fixed. And the first repair, he said, it's ugly. I want it to be beautiful again. So an artisan took the pieces, used a lacquer mixed with gold dust in the seams. So it's beautiful again, not because of the brokenness, but because of the repair. Mm-hmm. When adoption is done right, if it's done well, it's beautiful not because of the brokenness that caused the need for it, the fact that a mom couldn't care for a child, that a family wasn't able to parent in another way, but because of the repair that was done. Yeah, is the beauty.
I'm glad you described it that way, because I would suspect rarely, if ever, is that child a perfect child.
Well, I've got two wonderful kids. They weren't perfect.
They're not perfect.
And I was definitely not a perfect child for my parents. And I think I go back to the story of Moses a lot when I'm thinking about adoption. And to me, one of the things that tells us God cares about the vulnerable child, you look at the number of children who were raised by somebody other than their parents who are mentioned significantly in the Bible. You got Moses. You got Joseph. Talk about a dysfunctional family. Yeah. You know, my brothers and I fought, but we never sold each other into slavery. You've got Samuel, who's raised by Eli. You've got Esther, who's raised by a relative. Mm-hmm. And even, from an earthly standpoint, Jesus had a stepfather.
I was going to say, our Lord himself.
So, that vulnerable child theme kind of runs through the story itself. He put them into the story so that they could identify. But Moses' adoption story, I often, when I'm speaking to a church, we'll use the old flannel graph. Remember that one?
Mm-hmm. We were in Sunday school, the flannel graph.
Yeah. And you go in one Sunday, and Moses is in the bulrushes, and he gets found by Pharaoh's daughter, and she goes and adopts him. The next Sunday you come in, you got Moses out in front of the burning bush. How did he get from the palace to the burning bush?
But yeah, there's a gap there.
There's a gap there. And what significant piece happens is one day he sees an Egyptian mistreating one of his people. Now, wait a minute. He was raised in Pharaoh's household. Right. But his mom nursed him. Mm-hmm. And Pharaoh's daughter gave him the name drawn out of water. That's what Moses means.
Mm-hmm. You're right.
He knew his story. He had an identity so that when he saw injustice happening, he was defending his identity. And then the next day, two Hebrews are fighting, and he says, guys, cut it out. And they say, what are you going to do, kill us too? Yeah. And realizes he really doesn't fit in with either of them. So that's when he goes out and hangs out with Laban and gets 40-year internship taking care of sheep before he spends 40 years leading the children of Israel through the wilderness.
I love that story of Moses. I tell people about it. My favorite part of it is when Moses is putting out all of these excuses, mm-hmm. and finally the Lord says, what's in your hand? Yeah. And that's what we can, as Agape and others, can say, well, what can I do?
And that's what I think, as people hear us talk about the importance God places on the vulnerable and serving the vulnerable, not everybody's called to foster or adopt. Right. But everybody's called to do something. Question of what's in your hand is that perfect question. Some people may have a skill. I have had, recently we had a church who the ladies of the church got together on a Saturday and put together a bunch of casseroles and put them in the freezer and said, when you guys have a placement, come get one and take it to the family so they don't have to worry about dinner that night. It was something I wouldn't have thought of doing. But they said, we have this gift, and we want to bless you with that gift. For some people, that's being a financial supporter of Agape or another agency that's caring for vulnerable children. For some people, it's they know somebody who's fostering. And being that person who's going to be there regardless. Even when the kid's misbehaving at church, even when they're having a tough time, you're going to be alongside them.
They're being kids.
Yes.
My kids misbehaved in church. Well, my kids did things that disappointed me. Okay.
Yeah. And And the thing that we know now is trauma that happens before you have words is some of the hardest trauma to deal with.
Okay.
Because, again, you can't verbalize. All you have is the body sensation of what happened.
Yeah.
And when you experience something that gives you that same sensation, that fight, flight, freeze pops up and you start acting out.
Yeah.
And you can't tell anybody else what's going on. So when that happens in a Sunday school class because of something going on that smelled the same way and we don't know what it is,
Right. Okay.
there's no explanation. They can't tell you why. Sometimes kids are just kids, but sometimes it's the trauma coming out again.
Triggered it.
But I say all that to say, one of the things that people can do is, I know when I was a kid, there were certain people in the church that I grew up in who saw me. I wasn't just the kid running around. I wasn't just the kid. There was a guy, Billy Leopard, who had a special name for me. He didn't call me Steve. He called me Steve Areno every time he saw me. I knew Mr. Leopard saw me. And being that person for a child who hasn't been seen a lot, who's been neglected, being that one that gets excited when they walk through that door at church, that's something that's in your hand that you can do to serve a child in a foster family.
You know, I said James 1:27. God's not giving us a procedure there or whatever limitation. That's the principle. You're taking care of orphans and widows, the most vulnerable. There's another verse of Scripture I think that about when I think about agape, and that's Matthew 25. Starting in verse 31, Jesus is describing the judgment scene, and he lists several things there that may not appear too important from the basis of judgment, but it's giving relief to the hungry and the thirsty and clothing the naked and visiting the sick and imprisoned. And like James, it isn't so much a checklist as it is a frame of mind of caring for others, getting out of yourself. What can I do? Can I visit the sick? Can I visit a child or take care of a child? And so I just love those two scriptures.
Yeah.
Because that's showing the importance. And Jesus said in that statement in Matthew 25, when you've done it to the least of these, you've done it to me. And so again, we don't need to forget that. We're doing this in honor of our Lord.
Right.
We're adopted children into the family of God.
Right.
And like an adoptive or foster situation today, or at least in an adoptive situation, that child is a full member of that family. And with all the rights and privileges and responsibilities of a natural born child into that family. And we need to remember that as well. But God honors that.
Yes.
That's the beauty of it. Wow. I've got so much that we could go on. Again, special children, special people. Situation is, I was going to say rarely perfect, never perfect.
Right.
There's always adjustments and all of that. Okay. We could go, this is great. Yeah, I've tried to have special guests on the podcast. You're ranked real high.
Thank you.
And I appreciate that. Any other thoughts? Well, yes, there is something else I wanted to ask you about. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Obviously, Agape relies on such a wide range of people. And I'd like to know some things like, how can someone help Agape, whether they're an organization, an individual, a congregation, anything like that. How can they help Agape?
I think there's a couple of ways that Agape they can partner with Agape. One of the most important ways is praying for Agape.
Oh, absolutely.
Praying for our staff. The work that we do is hard. And again, they're seeing the brokenness of the world on a daily basis. And that they would be sustained in that ministry.
Yeah.
And for our foster and adoptive parents as well. What they're doing is hard work.
And for the children.
And for the children, that they would be mirrored, that what they're experiencing would mirror God's love for them.
Friends, let's just take a quick break. We're speaking with Steve Duer with the Agape of Central Alabama. I hope you'll stay with us as we continue listening to this Steve as he talks about this wonderful, wonderful organization.
I'm a storyteller, David, so
I am
cut
too.
me off. So,
no, please.
Last November, we had one of our pregnancy center partners reached out to us and said, we got a 34-week pregnant mom who is talking about making an adoption plan. Can you meet with her? And we said, sure, be glad to. So we meet with the mom. Oh, and they said, oh, by the way, she's Hindu. So that's a bit of a difference. We don't get a lot of Hindu families that we're working with. So we went and met with this young lady and her parents. And the young lady was having to translate for her parents while we were talking. So there's a real interesting dynamic going on. And the first thing we told the parents was, we're a Christian agency and we only place with Christian families. If that's a problem, we can refer you to another agency. Mm-hmm. But we wanted to be transparent, and they said, that's fine. And the father said, we just want this to go away. And he said, this doesn't happen in our culture. So we kept meeting with them. And about halfway through the conversation, the dad interrupted our worker and said, so you'll be at the hospital? And our worker said, yes, sir, I'll be at the hospital. He said, the whole time? And our worker said, as long as you want us there, we'll be there. And he said, but you're Americans. What if the baby's born on Christmas Day? Will you be there?
Okay.
And our worker said, yes, sir, we'll be there. And the baby was not born on Christmas Day. The baby was born 2 days before Christmas, which if you know how hospitals work, that meant discharge was Christmas Day.
Uh-huh.
And our worker was there bright and early to help this mom and her mother get back to their house. Found a pharmacy open on Christmas Day to be able to get the prescriptions filled, to be able to, so the mom would be comfortable. And I did something Christmas Day I'm not supposed to do. I opened my email on my phone, checked work email. And in my email box was an email from a young lady, or from a name I didn't recognize, and the subject line was our maternity worker's name. So I opened it up, and it says, Mr. Duer, I got your email address from the form they gave us when we first started meeting. The only form that has my email address on it is the complaint form, the grievance form.
Oh, no. Okay.
So I'm a little nervous when I read that sentence.
Okay.
But she goes on to talk about what a great job our staff had done meeting her needs, making sure the hospital understood her family's wishes, talked about, in fact, that's how I know our worker found a pharmacy for them, was because she told me that she found us a pharmacy open on Christmas Day.
Wow.
And at the end of the email, she says, Mr. Duer, we're Hindu. We don't really believe in Jesus. But she showed us how Jesus is without ever saying his name. And I think about the seeds that we're planting in the lives of the moms that we work with, in the lives of the children that we serve. We may never see trees come out of those seeds. Mm-hmm. But we're planting the seeds. God gives the increase. We're not responsible for the increase. But prayers for those seeds that we plant. Yeah. That they would take root and grow. And so prayer is an important thing. And if somebody's interested, we actually have a program that if they'll contact us through our Montgomery office, we can...
it's Agape of
Central Alabama. Yeah. Our website's Agape FOR children.org.
Okay.
But we have a prayer guide that we can send out. It's got a magnet that has 7 days of each day of the week, a different prayer focus. And then some material to go with that to encourage people to pray. Another thing that they can do is financial support. Again, our ministry takes money. People are our ministry. Yeah. And we have to have the money to pay people. As the numbers of maternity moms increased, we sent out an appeal to our supporters, and they responded.
Yeah. Well, this is an area where congregations can help too. I know in our congregation, one of our elders is very closely associated with Agape, David Hall.
David Hall, yeah.
And so every year we have a special Agape Emphasis Day, but we also have the coin cans that are great. I take a coin can. Actually, we take two. And I take it as a challenge to fill that thing. And if by the time, over the period of time that we're going to be turning it in, it's not, we fill it up.
Yeah.
And we put a little folding money as well as coins in there.
Well, and since the pandemic, coins have kind of fallen out of favor.
Yeah.
Or people are using their cards.
Yeah.
We now have an app called the Roundup app that you can select Agape as as your charity of choice. And it will round up your credit card purchases to the next dollar. And you can put a cap of how much I want to do each month. So I don't want to go over this amount a month, so you can still have your budgeting piece to it.
Sure.
Or you can just set a flat rate that'll be charged to your credit card each month. And then we get that money from that, because some people kept telling us, I don't use cash anymore. And we said, well, there's still a way you can help with Agape. But it's, then there's ministry projects that we have from time to time. Like, for example, we just had a church who heard about our situation and said, what do you give moms? And I said, well, we have a backpack that we give moms when they go to the hospital. It's got, a small blanket in it. It's got the fuzzy socks that are better than the hospital fuzzy socks they give you, lotion, just some things, an insulated mug to keep by their bedside.
Some comfort items.
Some comfort items, a journal and a pen so they can keep memories, that kind of thing. And then if the mom chooses to parent, that backpack can then be used almost as a diaper bag.
Okay.
And if she chooses to make an adoption plan, it's not stigmatizing to her as as walking out with a diaper bag as a backpack kind of thing. So that church put together the contents and gave us the money to buy the backpacks. We have a specific backpack that we buy. So we said, let us do the backpack, but here's how much they typically cost. And they did a small group project for a small group to get a certain number of those together. We've had another church who did entry into care packs for children when they first were placed in foster care. So that we have, we got these little small backpacks all over our office that say, boy 10 to 12 kind of thing. So it's got, toiletry items, pair of a pack of underwear, those kind of just very basic things.
Sure.
We had another church who did a diaper drive for us.
Okay.
And they were responsive. They said, what do you need? I said, well, every time we do a diaper drive, people love getting newborn in ones. Babies don't stay in those very long. Where they stay in for a long time is the 4s, 5s, pull-ups. That's where kids stay in that size range for longer. So we've got plenty of the smaller sizes. Can you help us out with? And they blessed us with some large diapers, and our workers' faces lit up, and our foster families appreciated that. So there's some really unique projects, and the great thing is we didn't come up with a single one of those. A church or a care group came up with that and came to us. Yeah. So sometimes people have ideas that we don't know.
Well, something that my wife and I do every year, again, I don't carry change with me, so I'm always putting it in a jar. And we have, every year at Christmas, we have a change jar that we find anonymously. I give it to somebody else to give it to the person because I don't want them to know. One year somebody found out it was us, and I was real embarrassed. But anyway, I got to thinking as you were talking, if somebody knows in their congregation somebody who is an adoptive parent or a foster parent, you now have a target to do things for that family. And doing something like that anonymously is such a joy.
Well, and we have a donor who makes it anonymous, and every year we have a conversation, and he says, how many foster parents do you have? And I tell him the number, and he says, okay, I'm going to send you a check. You go buy $50 Chick-fil-A cards for all your foster
There you go.
families and send it to them at Christmas time.
Yeah.
And you think, well, some of us can run through Chick-fil-A anytime we want to, but if you're a foster family that's got your own kids and somebody else's kids, that's an expensive trip.
Yes.
And to have that gift, I can't tell you the number of times we've been interviewing our families for something, and they talk about the Chick-fil-A gift cards.
Okay.
And it's just been one of those things that the donor heard me speak one time, and he told me he was going to do it, and he's done it, I think, 4 years in a row now.
Yeah.
And it's just a blessing. And again, it's just a unique way of meeting the needs.
But there's so many ways. So be creative. You can help out as an individual, as part of an organization to sponsor something, or congregation.
Right. And
Absolutely.
I will say, one of the things I've learned since I became executive director is we're doing kingdom work. And if I'm only talking about Agape, I may be saying that I don't trust God that he has enough resources to meet all of our needs that are in kingdom work. So I always try to emphasize there are other agencies out there that may speak to you in a more direct way of, hey, I want to be aligned with this agency who's doing this to serve vulnerable children. Do it.
Yeah,
These same
absolutely.
things we're talking about for Agape can help Child Haven, can help
North Alabama
Christian Children's Home, can help Mount Dora, can help Agape of North Alabama, or Agape of Georgia, or Nashville, or Memphis. So all those same things I'm talking about, it doesn't matter what agency it is, do something.
Yeah.
That's always my thing, do something.
Yeah. It's about the children.
That's exactly right.
Absolutely. Okay. So one last question. If somebody is interested in becoming an adoptive parent or a foster parent, I assume they can go to the Agape website and find at least the initial information.
Yes.
And then begin that process. Is it a rigorous and lengthy process?
It is. There's truly a counting the cost side of it. And the foster care process is designed that you have to go through 30 hours of training plus some additional, like first aid, CPR, those kind of things. But 30 hours of just foster parent training, that's a long time. Well, during that time, they're assessing, is this right for me and my family? And we're assessing, are you the right family for us or not? We've had families who've gone through the process, and I tell them on day one, I would rather you opt out the day before we approve you than to be unsure and think, I don't think this is right for me, and a kid comes in your home, and then we have impacted a kid because you realize once that kid's there, it's not right for me. This is so that we can protect children.
Right.
And equip you. I mentioned that my parents fostered. This was before training existed. The attitude then was, well, you've raised your own boys, you can raise somebody else's. Well, my brothers and I had not been abused or neglected. And that relationship that we had with our parents, that discipline was based off of, has started with them meeting our needs from a very early age. When a kid walks in your home, you don't have that. You don't have the deposits in that relationship bank to make a withdrawal for punishment. So what do? There's a training element to that that's real important. And then the home study process, we ask nosy questions because we want to know that your family's stable. There's introducing a child in the foster care system into your home is stressful to your family. And we want to make sure you've got the supports and the plans to be steady in that process and stable. On the adoption side, it's much more of an individualized process as opposed to a group process. But it is, in addition to some real intense individual meetings, there's some books that we recommend reading. And there's a lot of conversation about what our model is, and we have some families really early on who opt out because they're trying to meet their needs with adoption as opposed to meet a child's needs.
Sure.
And that's just we're a different agency.
Yeah.
And we chose to do it that way for a reason.
Is it expensive?
Foster care, there's not so much expense on the front end. Taking care of another child, you get a stipend from the state. to cover some room and board, but it doesn't cover the full cost. So there's an expense to that. We're able to help out some with some of those things. One of the things that we do for all of our families is as soon as a child comes into the home, we tell the family, buy what you need and we'll reimburse $100 of it. So sometimes that's a car seat because the family got a child who needs a car seat and they didn't have an extra one at the house for the right size for that child. Sometimes they came in with no clothes and they got to get them ready for school.
Sure.
So that $100 is just one of those things and I see the receipts when I'm signing off on the reimbursement checks, and they're regularly spending well over the $100.
Oh, sure they are.
And that's just the reality of it. On the adoption side, it's not inexpensive. We do a sliding fee scale with our families, so it's based on a percentage of your adjusted gross income on your 1040 form. The people say, well, why does it still cost so much to adopt? It's a complicated process.
Legal fees and health.
The legal fees are over here. They're paid to the attorney.
Okay.
But the home study process takes, that's about, I would say, by the time you do the home study process, the waiting time where we're still being supportive to the family and staying in touch with the family, and then the placement, the range is going to be between $17,000 and probably $25,000 that you'd pay to Agape.
Okay.
And people go, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
Well, that whole time we were supporting you before, during, and even after. That's a lot of staff time we've invested.
Sure.
I mentioned earlier, 80% of the moms we work with choose to parent. It takes a lot of work for us to get to the place where a mom makes an adoption plan. And part of those fees cover that service as well.
Okay.
So we are one of the lowest fee adoption agencies in the state.
Okay. Well, I asked that because there's some practical things
Sure.
to consider and the cost of it. I mean, I might need to do some remodeling of my home.
Right.
Or maybe purchase another vehicle and, just some practical things. There may be school expenses and various things. So it needs to be a reality check.
Right. One of the things we do for our adoptive families, we actually pay for a service. It's called My Adoption Finance Coach. We're not experts on all the different grant opportunities that are out there. There's some low interest or no interest loans for adoption out there. We can't keep up with all that. So we pay for this service to meet with our families and say, here's how you can do your adoption. Here's some fundraising ideas. There's one fundraising idea I absolutely love. It's out of a group out of Nashville called Both Hands. Both Hands.
Okay, Both
Hands. And it's based off James 1:27. And then they send out fundraising letters, them and their team. So you're helping a family serving a vulnerable child, and you're helping a widow who needs something done to her house. It's Both Hands. And it's a beautiful, beautiful way. But and the reason that came up was a guy was sent a fundraising letter about something else, and he said, if you were helping a widow, I'd help you. And so he thought, why don't we do that? And now he's got this foundation that's in Nashville, and sometimes they'll have matching grants for families. But there's resources out there to help reduce the cost of adoptions for families as well.
As you're talking, my head's spinning with ideas. My wife and I are grandparents.
Right.
Well, I could be a surrogate grandparent to an adoptive family or a foster care family. So there's just so many ways to serve.
Yeah. For 14 years, our family lived in East Tennessee. Family was 8 hours away.
Yeah.
And there was a family at church up there who were the surrogate grandparents for our kids. They went to Grandparents' Day at school with our kids. That blessing was huge.
Oh, absolutely.
And we all have those people who poured into us. And that's what I was saying earlier about that person who sees that child at church and makes sure they're seen. That's powerful service in ministry. It matters.
Steve, We could talk for hours,
Yes,
my
we
friend.
could.
This is wonderful. Again, if somebody wants to help Agape, go to the Agape website. You'll find information, contact information, processes, resources, all sorts of things. And what is that website again?
It's Agape, AGAPE, 4FOR, children.org.
Okay, agape4children.org. That is awesome. Steve, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for what you do. Thank you for your leadership in this area and for your service to the Lord, to the church, to children. Amazing. Amazing. All right. Well, friends, thank you for joining us together as we journey to hope. I invite you to follow this podcast so you can continue to gain insights into not only our journey to hope, but how we can help others in their journey. I invite you to contact me if you have any questions or comments, or you wish to share with me something you've experienced in your journey to hope. My email is ourjourneytohope@gmail.com. That's ourjourney and the number 2, hope@gmail.com. I look forward to sharing more with you soon. Again, thank you for listening. And until our next episode, remember, we give all glory to God our Father.